Okay, this is History 1302, a continued lecture on the Old West, as it's called. But in reality, when we talk about the West in the United States, it's really the New West, not the Old West. The thing is about the Old West or the New West is its opening well, actually, by the time you get to 1900 or 1890, even closing as far as the frontier status is concerned, is that the West, in many respects, embodies the growth of the nation, the optimism of the nation in some respects after the Civil War. What's interesting when we talk about the mood of the United States after the Civil War, it's really kind of an ambivalent mood. Because on the one hand, you will find this grand, bounteous idea, the oyster of the United States, so to speak, is opening before us. Yet at the same time, you will find in other pockets of the United States, especially amongst the elites, say in the Ivy Leagues and the elites of the East, you'll find a profound disappointment and a profound doubt that has creeped into the psyche of many Northerners, let alone Southerners and their preoccupations with the late war. But out west, however, there is, generally speaking, optimism. And that's maybe because it's growing. I think that's part of it. Growing not just from immigrants from the United States, growing because of those immigrants coming into the United States for that bountiful, cheap land, just for mere cents on the dollar, frankly. And on top of that, you can get a lot of land free or nearly free. But it was also just simply because when we talk about the growth of the West, and in the sense the growth of the United States, is that there was, and I've said this before to you, but this is really one of the great giveaways and one of the great empowerments of the what we'll call now the middle class, and that's still into the future, frankly, as far as a true economic term. But for us in the the early 21st century, or in the first or second decade now, I guess it must be the third decade at this point of the 21st century. The thing is that this optimism, this middle class idea, this ability to grow and by the sweat of your brow, strength of your hands, the firmness of your back, all those sorts of things there. The idea that you can go further and further with those qualities about you, and you have your own land to own, is a wonderful departure from most of human history. In fact, almost every other nation, regardless of continent, does not issue land titles in mass quantities to mass people. The idea that a common man should own 100 acres or 200 acres, or through a little bit of luck, trickeration on the negative side, but certainly hard work and industry, he should accumulate 1,000 acres or whatever, even if it is in the Dakotas or even if it is in places that others wouldn't want to go to. That would be a foreign concept in many nations, in many kingdoms, and so forth, in antiquity, even in really respects up into the present time. But the United States gave away a lot of land. And that's true not just for the government, as I've said before, it's also true for the railroads. They will give away or sell lots of land to recoup the losses or recoup the investment in these transcontinental railroads and smaller lines. But to the building of these towns, and I've talked about what type of town do you need in the previous lecture, or what type of businesses do you need. But I want to add a little more to your notes on the issue of the town, and whether it's a cow town or a mining camp, especially those that have longevity and permanence to them, but especially just towns in general that end up going to be perhaps having railroads run through them. They will become major thoroughfares, and most of these cities that I mentioned to you, you'll have heard as I build my case for this optimism and this expanse of the West. So really one of the things I want you to consider isn't just what type of business do you need, and the questions has been asked over the years and recently by students of what were these towns like, what were these streets like. Well, one that I may not have said clearly to you, but I want to underscore to you now, is the idea of width and wideness and bounty. You've got plenty of land. If any of you who've watching this video have ever traveled to Europe, for example, of course, the old cities of Europe, and Europe is an old continent compared to the United States, or an old nations compared to the United States. What I mean by that is that, yes, I realize there were Native Americans who have lived in the Western Hemisphere for thousands of years. But what I mean by that is what we would constitute and call cities, like a Paris or a London or a Berlin or a Vienna or a Moscow or something of that nature. The major cities of Europe You do not have an analogous example in the United States. You don't. You have old cities, but you don't have analogous ones. And what that by that I mean is that you don't have. You may have a cathedral, but it doesn't go back to the year 1200, as like some of the cathedrals, or the year 1000. Some of the cathedrals do in England or elsewhere. Your cathedrals in the United States are merely 150, 200 years old, not nearly 1,000 years old. And so there's a youthfulness of the United States just in general that has been passed by and left aside by the Europeans. But even still then, let's talk about the width of streets, kind of to give you the idea, some concrete examples of how much the United States is growing and becoming more optimistic as it goes westward. Remember Cambridge, Massachusetts. Let's start with that town right there. Cambridge, Massachusetts sits just outside of Boston. It is the home of Harvard University, the great bastion of higher learning in America to the present time. If you can say that you graduated from Harvard, you can say a lot. Even more so than the Aggie ring, being a Harvardian has a lot of cachet. And frankly, the expectation would be is that if you graduated from Harvard, you're not going to be coming back to Snook, Texas, where I live, and become a school teacher. That's not to be snotty. That is just simple, or snarky. That is just simply to be honest. If you go to Yale or Harvard, there is nothing wrong with coming back. But many people, and maybe rightly so, would say you wasted let me think here. Let's say I think the tuition at Harvard and Yale is somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 80,000 a year. So you wasted somewhere close to a $250,000, maybe a third of $1,000,000, maybe even closer to $500,000 on a high education, and all you do is go back and be a school teacher in a public school in small town Texas or even suburban Texas. That would not be expected, and that would not be appreciated. And the reality is that you'd rub shoulders and you would be at school with people who, if you went to Harvard, who would be these future leaders of the United States in many respects, maybe politically, maybe economically, maybe somewhere else, but prominent individuals. Well, the reason I bring this up, though, is not just to go on that little rabbit chase right there. The thing is that when we say Harvard, it is the old line America. It is the old Puritan idea of America. And if there was a part of the United States that was very much modeled, in a sense, after Europe, you will see that with the Puritans. Not to say that they were in love with Europe. I mean, obviously a good number of Puritans migrate to North America to get away from, and in a sense, I'm careful when I use this word, though. I'm going to use it. In a sense, separate from Europe so they can live their religious convictions out. Yet they still take the trappings in some respects of architecture, of buildings and grid patterns and such with them when they come across the Atlantic Ocean in the 1600s. Cambridge, Massachusetts is a Puritan town, even though it's long since lost its Puritan values. Cambridge, Massachusetts, to the point, to the issue of the lecture in this case here, is how wide are the streets? In Cambridge, Massachusetts, when they lay the town out in the 1600s, they set the street widths at 30 feet. And the reason I say that is because if you've ever been to an old city in Europe, especially in the heart of the old city, the heart of old Paris, and the heart of old London, and the heart of the old city, you will find narrow streets, and you're thinking, how did people get down them? I can quite remember visiting Paris as a high schooler, a teenager, and the tour bus that we were on was just absolutely a mess. It was very tight, and how that man drove through there, he was a far better driver than I'd ever be. But at the same time, these are old cities, and they're accommodating horse and buggy, horse and cart versus, or just simply animals and foot traffic rather than automobile traffic. And so as we move away from Cambridge, another city, an early American city that predates the Revolution, the American Revolution, would be Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston, South Carolina is laid out, and it isn't as tight as Cambridge, but it's only 60 foot wide from right-of-way to right-of-way for the main thoroughfares through town. So 60 foot wide, that is better. However, not all that wide. Now, New York City early on is going to be much more like Charleston in the early days and much more like Cambridge in its earliest days. But by the time you get to the post-1800 New York, and you see New York going from being a city, an American city, to being the principal American city, meaning when you think of New York, you think of it being the quintessential American city, for good and for bad. Some of you may bridle a little bit at that statement, especially those of you who are proud Texans and say, no, New York does not represent my values or represent me. That may be true in some respects, but in other respects it's not. Whether we like it or not, New York, however, to the outside world is at least the major face of the United States. And so if you say New York City, a lot of outsiders look and say that's America, even if it's not actually completely true. And that's what I mean by this. But New York post-1800, when it becomes the great city for the United States, its minimum width as far as its streets are concerned is 60 feet, and its major north-south, east-west thoroughfares, its main streets, I think north of the 23rd Street, is at least going to be 100 foot wide. So they start widening out these streets, as you can see, as time goes on. And still, if we're in the 1800s, the automobile's still in the future. They haven't developed it yet. You're talking the late 1800s before the automobile is conceived of in a basic sense, let alone the Model T sense of the early 1900s. But we again move west now. Now we go to the Midwest, and now we go to the Mountain West, and we see what we're looking for, and we see how the West conceives of itself as a much wider and much more optimistic, a burgeoning, growing part of the country. Plus they have land, plenty of land to grow and spread out in. Two cities that you should have heard about. One I'm certain of because you had to probably memorize the capitals of the states of the United States. When you were somewhere in middle school, I'm guessing, is Sacramento, California. Sacramento, or if you're a basketball fan, home of the Sacramento Kings. Sacramento, California's streets, and the other one is Cheyenne, Wyoming, Cheyenne, Cheyenne, Wyoming. At least they lay out their streets like this, at least as far as the streets are concerned, they needed to be at least 80 feet wide. So you're seeing this growth, even for towns. Sacramento's a major city, of course, today, and Cheyenne is not. It is. Cheyenne's an important town in Wyoming, but it's not a major city. But all that to say, though, is that those are two important little towns. Important cities to get that growth idea. Omaha, Nebraska, home of the College World Series, if you like college baseball. Omaha, Nebraska sits up on the Missouri River and basically is in the eastern portion of that plain state. Omaha, Nebraska set its minimum width at 100 feet, and it will expand out in the late 19th and early 20th century to 120 feet right-of-ways for the main thoroughfares in town. And so these main boulevards, these main arteries flowing through these cities represent this great optimism and this great idea that there will be many people living here. There's abundant space for us to get around, and so on. Topeka, Kansas, the capital of the state of Kansas. Topeka, they're in these, I'll call it central eastern part of the state. It's not right on the border with Missouri or anything, but Topeka, Kansas has a minimum of 130 feet. You see that widening out. And still more, and this is the last example here in Utah, home of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is the Mormon, I'll call it the Mormon empire, if you like. But there, I say empire, that's what I mean by that is where the church is found there, is Salt Lake City. It's 132 foot wide. And put this in your notes too. And I don't know if there was a specific reason for this other than the concept was we just need more walk space. It's not just that the streets are 132 foot wide in Salt Lake City, but it has also got 20 foot wide sidewalks. And so you got ample public space. You kind of see this in a sense. Salt Lake City, as I understand the town's layout and grid over the years, I've seen it and heard it described as well, is that it's kind of more reflective of a Spanish influence in that you look in the downtown area around Salt Lake City, you have this open plaza, you have this, you see the Mormon Tabernacle Church, the Mormon Tabernacle, which is in downtown. You have the main banks and such. And you have the main businesses, you have the main government edifices, and they're all sitting on the town square, as it were, the main downtown plaza, kind of as if they were all had joined hands together, and that represented the surety and the stability of Utah writ large. But anyway, but still, regardless, there is an openness to it, there is an expansion to it, and what have you. And so you see these towns grow. In addition, one other thing I'd like to say too is that you also see out west with regard to land is that as you get toward the year 2000, you get toward the year 1900, you also start to see the rise of something else that will help actually hem in the land in a sense. On the one hand, it's really kind of a dichotomy. On the one hand, you have the openness and the prosperity and the optimism of the city, the large escapes that we just went through. But yet on the other hand, by the time you're getting toward the year 1900, you're going to see the closing of the frontier, not just rhetorically because you have all these people who have moved in, but you also have the closing of the frontier in that the open range is closing too. In the previous lecture, I talked about cattle and cattle drives and open range and so forth. And if I didn't say to use the word open range, that is clearly what I'm referring to when I talk about cattle drives and picking up longhorns and doing this and acquiring that. However, by the time you get to 1897, that's really gone. And as I said before to you, a historian of some note, a guy named Frederick Jackson Turner, had basically already said that the frontier was closed. Part of the reason the frontier closes is because of the advent of barbed wire. Barbed wire, if some of you know it quite well, I know it quite well because one of my eccentricities in life is that I like to build a fence in the summertime. Preferably, I'd rather build it in October at the time I'm recording, or say late September when I'm recording this lecture. But I'd rather build it in the fall or build it in the spring. But because I do this, meaning teach college for a living, I have to indulge my eccentricities when it's rather unpleasant. If you ever worked on a fence line in June or July, it can be hard. It can be brutal, beating down, and so on. Not to mention the fact that if you're handling barbed wire, whether it's old 12.5 gauge, which is the old standard, or something more modern like what's called gaucho wire, the fact of the matter is it can cut your arms and it make you bleed a little bit and cause you some problems. Those barbs are rather sharp. But all that aside is that how do you know where your land is? You're going to have, regardless whether it's fenced or not, you're going to have meets and bounds because you don't want people to get into fights over land, which they will if there is a conflict over property lines and such. So meets and bounds, those are there. So how do you define where your meets and bounds are? One of the ways you do it is through rocks or other markers and such. But another way you can do it is you can build the fence, which will clear, especially when it's right on the property line, it defines that area, left, right, and so on, east, west, and what have you. It will define that area, and that within that fenced area is mine. On top of the fact that you would have cattle, especially as you go forward, branded cattle, my cows, the G6 in my particular case, but you have these branded cows, and you have this property, these lines, these fenced-in territories, so you can have your cattle. See, the thing is that once you start closing off the land and you start closing out your area, you can do a lot of improvements to the stock. Whether it's in the form of genetic improvements, and I don't mean this like some sort of sci-fi novel territory like you might think of what happens at A&M, where there is molecular genetic improving going on, or at least attempts at it. What I'm talking about is you have your cows, your type of cows. Let's say you didn't want longhorns. You didn't want Texas steers because Texas steers actually don't do that well on the high plains. You get them up in the Dakotas, that thin skin of the longhorn freezes his hide to death when it gets cold. And it was colder back then because of various reasons, including probably climate change. But regardless of whether it was climate change or lack of trees or just sunspot activity, it doesn't matter. It's demonstrably colder in the late 19th century than it is in the time period we live today. All of which is to say, longhorns don't do so well on the high plains. You'll see in the blizzards of 1886, 87, I think it was, you will see thousands of Texas beeves get killed up on the high plains because they froze to death. Far better cattle to live on the high plains would be Angus or Herefords, which are more English stock. But you have to bring them over. But you have to buy them. But you have to have the cow and the bull. And so what you end up doing is that if you're a serious rancher and you're wanting to make a go of this is your calling in life. You've moved onto the plains. and you are ready to erect and build this great ranch in eastern Montana, which is not mountainous, by the way. Eastern Montana is flat as a pancake, just like eastern Wyoming is flat as a pancake. The fact of the matter is that you would not want your cattle to go drifting off onto somebody else's land. You're not going to want your purchased stock, your Hereford or your Angus, for two easy examples, wandering and mixing with other cattle, say inferior quality Texas Longhorn types. And you don't want that bull that you spent good money on to buy, who is going to, or bulls plural probably, but you're not going to want that good bull spending time with somebody else's cows. You want him spending time with your cows. So it helps improve the stock of the cow. It helps improve the herd. It helps improve neighborly relations, and it closes the frontier. And it has effect, of course, also in a direct manner upon the Native Americans who live on the plains, whether it's in the South Plains around Lubbock or Amarillo, or in the High Plains where the Sioux would live up on in the Dakotas, for example. Because when you start to close the land and you start to fence it in, as it were, you really put the hurt on this idea of free range and roaming and nomadic life, which some cowboys and cattlemen preferred, and some cowboys, or rather some Native Americans, well, frankly, most Native Americans on the plains, that's what their lifestyle was like. So it has the effect, too, a little bit. This barbed wire is going to have the effect of bringing to an end the open range in many facets, in many ways. Anyways, the barbed wire was not developed by any Texan or anybody in the South. You wouldn't think it, but barbed wire was developed by a couple of Illinois farmers. I gather from the basics of the story is that they were kind of tinkerer types. But anyways, two farmers, two rancher types in Illinois, Joseph Glidden and Jacob Heisch. They're going to patent, which is, of course, important, means you're going to make money off of your invention. Patents are important. In 1874, they patented and are able to sell barbed wire at $20 per 100 pounds. That's frankly expensive. But as you refine the process and as you refine the technique and you improve your materials and so on, and you just frankly figure out what you're doing more and more, and you get more of an economy of scale sort of idea, one of the things to understand is that oftentimes, just like TV prices or phone prices or this price or that price, they start out here, but as they become more common, they do that. So in 1897, the price per 100 pounds of barbed wire, good barbed wire, quality barbed wire, was $1.97 per 100 pounds. So you can see it just the prices collapsed, but in a good way. It's good for the rancher, good for the farmer, even good for the developer, because he can sell more barbed wire instead of at that high princely cost. So these communities are wide open. But at the same time, there's a closing aspect, and it's really kind of, like I said, a dichotomy out there. So we'll close, we'll move to the next facet of our lecture, and that is those wild and woolly mining camps. Those mining camps, they are oftentimes, especially in their early days, they are male-dominated. No two ways about it. However, they are noted for explosive growth, topsy-turvy growth, fires, and just general disease and occasional gunfights, rambunctiousness, rowdiness, and so on. These mining camps are oftentimes just as violent and certainly as noteworthy as the cow towns that we referenced in a previous lecture, like Abilene or Dodge City, Kansas. They're male-dominated, though, and that's something to remember. If you think about what's going to draw a person to a camp, it's going to be the promise of easy wealth. If I just dig a hole in the ground, I will find a rich vein of silver or gold, and then I will be able to become a wealthy man on my own. And so it's a hope and a dream, and it's mostly just that, as a dream. If you're talking about living in these camps, who made the money? Obviously, a few miners did, and probably the miners who either sold their deeds and their leases wisely, or the big timers who came in and bought them up and had the ability to really develop a vein of gold or silver. They made money. George Hearst, as I referenced in a previous lecture, George Hearst would be an example of this mining camp ability. This man made a lot of money, and his son made even more. But most men who made money didn't do it that way. They did it by what they sold. So if you could sell something that a miner needed, or somebody who was in these camps needed, you could become a fairly successful businessman and frankly fairly wealthy. I don't mean extraordinarily wealthy in the sense like you're going to be moving to Park Avenue wealthy or River Oaks wealthy, but certainly you're not going to be living in you can eventually afford to build yourself a very nice home. And so what would you sell? I mean, if you were the runner of the general store, if you were that had all the mining camp supplies and such, and if you figured out a way to isolate and make to make it your own way, rather make your store the only store in town, the company store, so to speak, then you could really make some money. So the people who sold stuff tended to work that way to make money. And frankly, you even see this to this day. If you look around West Texas, if you got friends and family who have gone out to the Odessa, Midland, Permian Basin, Big Spring territory when the oil boom was hot, say a year or two or three ago at the time of this recording, people made money not so much on the oil in the ground. Obviously, some did that, but it was the ability to scratch out a few slips and charge exorbitant rent for an RV park. So that would be an example right there. You can go on to the list. It's fairly extensive. Maybe sell food or what have you, which would be true also in these mining camps. And to give you some statistics, a guy named Charlie Andrews sold a keg of burnt nails when his house burned. He said it like this. He said, he wrote, he's like, I sold a keg of burnt nails, meaning his house is the nails that came out of his house because nails were so scarce. He sold this keg for $800, which in the 1870s or 80s when this happened is a princely sum. Others recorded that in, say, Helena, Montana, which was another mining camp, copper, if I remember correctly, for them. There was a shortage of eggs and bread. Eggs cost $5 a dozen, which is extraordinarily, that's high even for today's prices. And a loaf of bread costs $10 a dozen, which is outstandingly high compared to today even. And so this one man said it very well. He said, I would have made money if I could live without eating. I could have made money if I could live without eating, and that was a true statement in that era. But when you talk about what was there to do, like I said, very heavily weighted toward the men in the early days, you will have prostitution. Prostitution was quite common. And in Helena, Montana, again, that mining camp in Montana, prostitution was the practice, and it was the business or job, I guess you could say, vocation for women in the early days of that town. So really the first 30 or so years of that town, prostitution was very, very heavy in that community. Eventually that dies out as the mines die down or they become more standardized. The wildcatting aspect goes away. More families move in. You can see these things start to change over time. But the early days of a town, whether that's a few years or a few decades, they can be awfully wild and awfully crazy. And so the last one I want to mention to you before we move to law and order is this. There's lots of mines. You've got Tombstone, which was a silver camp down there in the Arizona territory. You've got stuff in Leadville, Colorado. You've got many mines up in the Colorado Rockies. Montana, I've already mentioned several times. But of all the great mines in the United States, this is the one that kind of rings the bell. And not just because of the amount of ore that comes out of it, it's also because of the frankly, the mythology that comes with it. And that would be the Comstock lode of Nevada, the Comstock lode. The Comstock lode of Nevada, and really it sits in the Sierra Nevadas right on the California line. It's up around Reno, Carson City, and that part of the world. But when you talk about the Comstock lode, it is the gold standard for mines. In fact, actually, it produces billions of dollars in our terms, billions of dollars of gold and silver. It was really actually a better silver mine, but it was first discovered as a gold mine. But the Comstock lode is this great producer of wealth. It produced wealth for those who sold stuff, as I've already indicated. It produced wealth for those who mined it and figured out how to keep the mine shafts from falling apart, and it even made people go mad and crazy. It's named after a fellow named Henry Comstock, Henry Old Pancake Comstock. You will find these individuals, and they're true. It's in these mining camps or these oil boom towns or these these bonanza towns. You will find these cranks and eccentrics. These, I guess, eccentric is the nice way of saying crank, but at the same time, these fascinating and infuriating characters. And Comstock is one of those guys. Henry Comstock probably found one of the earliest veins of the lode that bears his name. Lode is spelled Lode. But Comstock is also not above trying to get people to sign over this and that. And it's again, this is about 1859, so right before the Civil War gets underway. And so Comstock is able to force some men to sign off deeds to him, and he claims to have found the first the vein of the lode and so on. And before it's all said and done, Comstock sells his claim to the mother lode, to the Comstock lode, just for a few $1,000s. Had he held on to his claims, he might have been able to go out and become a very wealthy man. But for the rest of his life, and it's a kind of a bizarre life at that, he wanders through towns claiming to be owning this and doing that. He's really just kind of a misfit type character. And anyways, Henry Comstock is the namesake for that lode. By the way, the reason they called him Old Pancake, it was because he was so cheap he didn't make his bread, his flour into bread. He just cooked it into pancakes, and so it stuck. That's where he got it from. But the Comstock lode is, like I said, first a gold mine, but more especially a silver mine. It is one of the great silver mines in the history of the world, in fact. So if you look at, go to Reno, Nevada on a gambling trip, you're in the Sierra Nevadas for skiing, Lake Tahoe, it would do you well to drag your kids, once you get, I'm assuming once you get married sort of thing, drag them to a museum or two that's in there about the Comstock lode. Lots of men have made money and lost it in that part of the world. But all these communities are going to need to have some sort of law and order because of the rambunctiousness and the rowdiness of these mining camps, these cow towns, these newly birthed municipalities. You will have prominent outlaws. Here's just a handful for you right here, one of which is a fellow named Wild Bill Longley, Longley, Wild Bill Longley. He is going to be hung in Giddings, Texas. Longley was hung when he was 27 years old. He's hung in front of 4,000 people who gathered to see him hung at Giddings, which is just right down the road from here, and he kills about 10, 15 people about 20 people in his lifetime. Anyways, he said himself he regretted only killing one man, and that was when he was up on the plains at Dodge City. It may have been Abilene, but I think it was actually Abilene, and he shot a man for breathing too hard because, anyways, he thought the man was giving him the stink eye. Anyways, he said that he found out later the man was on the run just like he was. But yeah, he was dead at age 27. He killed Freedman. He was kind of a retrograde he wasn't actually ex-Confederate, but he was a Confederate sympathizer at the end of the Civil War. He killed some freedmen. He killed some state policemen. He will go up onto the camps, kill various and sundry individuals. And it was Longley who, standing in the gallows, looks over those 4,000 individuals to see him hang there in Giddings, says, "I see quite a few enemies and very few friends, mighty few friends." John Wesley Hardin is another one of those outlaw types, just a hardcore killer sort that you find in the pages of the Old West. John Wesley Hardin killed almost 30 individuals in his lifetime, and he had killed 4 by the time he was 15. He was one of those fellas, again, kind of a hard-struck individual. He just had a bad spirit about him. His name is kind of indicative of what he grew up in. He grew up in a household that was actually devoutly Methodist. John Wesley is the founder of Methodism. Some of you might go to a Methodist church now or in the past. The thing is that John Wesley Hardin, he's going to get caught up in the Sutton-Taylor feud and all the shenanigans in Texas during the Reconstruction period. He guns down a state policeman. He guns down people on the high plains. He guns down people at El Paso. And eventually, Hardin will be captured out around Pensacola, Florida, and he will be brought back to Texas. And Hardin will ultimately be he will be convicted of one murder. He's sentenced to prison, and he spends about 20 years in the Texas penitentiary. Then he is pardoned for reasons that are never quite exactly clear, but he's pardoned by the Texas governor in 1894. He moves to El Paso. Hardin hangs his shingle out as a lawyer, and eventually gets shot while shaking the dice in the Acme Saloon in El Paso. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. And then another name, and this is probably the last one I'll give you, is a fellow named Wild Bill Hickok. Wild Bill Hickok is going to be himself really kind of the segue for me to go forward. On the one hand, you find Wild Bill Hickok being kind of an outlaw, chasing after cheap and easy riches, an inveterate gambler. One of his best friends was a part-time prostitute named Calamity Jane. And you find Bill Hickok all over the Midwest. At some times in his life, you will find Wild Bill Hickok more on the side of disorder and criminality. Yet at other times in Wild Bill's life, you will find him more on the side of law. And in fact, at Abilene for a period of time, Wild Bill will wear the shield of a policeman. He will wear the star of the marshal. Not the U.S. Marshal, but the city marshal sort of thing. But you'll also then find Wild Bill in 1876 up on the Dakota Territory at another one of those mining camps. The Dakotas were notorious for gold mines, especially there around Deadwood, South Dakota, today Deadwood, South Dakota. So you might as well put that name in your notes. Deadwood is another one of those mining camps. And Wild Bill was an inveterate gambler, and he loved to play poker. He loved to play faro. He loved to play the cards. Problem is he made enemies, and what happened to him was that he was playing cards one day, and a man slipped up behind him and shot him in the back of the head. And so you find all these men, and it's more often true than not, is those who live by the sword will, as they say, die by the sword. In the case of Billy the Kid, same principle. Pat Garrett shoots him down. So, but then you have the law enforcement types who are more law enforcement than they are on the other side of the law. The famous examples, you've got several out there. Ben Thompson out of Austin was a prominent law enforcement man. One of the great shootist of all of the law enforcement sheriff types, marshal types that are out there. Ben Thompson, to look at him, you would not think was a Westerner. He dressed in a duster. He wore the finest clothing, and he cleaned up Austin. He cleaned it up. He got rid of the vagrants, but more especially, he got rid of the murderers and the ne'er-do-wells and the folks who caused property theft and so forth. He cleaned it up, and then he got bored and he shot out the lights. But it was generally accepted that Ben Thompson was the best shootist in all of the community until he himself, like many of the others who live by the gun, will die by the gun. If we're thinking about the Earps, there's certainly plenty of information on them. Perhaps of all the individuals that are out there, the Earp brothers, especially Wyatt, has generated more books, more essays, more movies than any of these other characters that we find. But one of the friends and one of the associates of Wyatt Earp would be the Mastersons. And one particularly I want to point out to you out of Kansas territory, a fellow named Batmasterson. The Masterson brothers, especially Bat, which was a nickname, was a derivation of the word Bartholomew. Bartholomew Masterson, Batmasterson, was what everybody called him, was himself kind of like his Ben Thompson. Marshal Masterson, or Sheriff Masterson, was a great shootist. In fact, he had the ability to draw his little peacemaker, and it was peacemakers were about 8 inches long, or 7 inches long. But he had a shorter peacemaker, a single action, cock the hammer, firing gun. And Masterson had the ability to draw from the hip and fire and create with an outline pattern of bullets in soft metal. He could create a Sioux Indian in his war bonnet. He was that good of a shootist. Practiced every day. He joked, he said, if I look at my gun wrong, it goes off. However, he was really one of the great shooters out there. By the way, he, like I said, dressed not as a Westerner, but dressed as a Victorian dandy. He always walked with a cane. Initially, it was because he'd gotten caught up in a shootout and a bullet passed through his hip and kind of cracked the hip bone, but he survived, and his girlfriend got killed in the process, and he was in his 20s. He will be found throughout the High Plains. That is Masterson. Again, dealing out law and order, at times rough-hewn law and order, at other times just keeping the peace. But like many men, as he grew older, he got bored with what he was doing and maybe just also realized that he was slowing down a little bit. If you live as a known shootist and a known law and order type, there will be other young men especially, who will want to try to get the old lion and will try to get the old bull, in this case Batmasterson, and kill him. And so Masterson leaves the Midwest, and then in the 1890s, you find Masterson not in the Midwest. You actually find him in New York City as a sports writer for a major newspaper. He writes on baseball games, amongst other things. He lives in New York City for a season of life. And then Masterson, who had friends in high places and low places. High places include the White House. One of Masterson's friends was himself a bit of a Westerner, even though he was born and lived most of his life in New York City or around New York City, and that would be Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, had offered Masterson, when Masterson was in his 50s, if I'm remembering my dates correctly, offered him the opportunity to become a U.S. Marshal of Oklahoma. And Masterson said, I'm too old. My eyes are going, and someone's going to slip up behind me and get me, and I'm not really interested in that anymore. So you have, and that was just a very brief tour of it, but you have all these characters floating about in the Old West in that Western time period. Some of the stuff that is said about the West is true, and some of it is just rank mythology. It just depends on what you're looking at. So that's a good place for us to wrap up. And for the next lecture, we're going to head to the railroads. We're going to spend a good deal of time talking about railroads, and more particularly corporations, but especially on the railroads, and we'll go from there. Thank you.